Greetings. I'm Dr. Eileen O'Connor, and I'll be presenting overview information on assessment. A key aspect of assessment, particularly in digitally enhanced environments, considers how do we know if understanding and skills we intend to communicate have actually been transferred. So in this video lecture, I'm going to use the language and historical developments that bring in their inherent ambiguity and overlap to build a framework for designing and assessing learning environments. You cannot separate assessment from what you really want to have your learner or client understand. Together they make a continuous process. And with the language I'll be using here, good designers also ask the larger evaluative questions where they step back and look at the larger education or communication program itself to see if it's serving the learning process effectively. Thus, any consideration and conversation about assessment has to start with the questions of what is it that is to be learned and why is this learning important? The answer depends upon the content itself and how this content is communicated. Are there abstractions that might be associated with learning the content? And where and how is applying this content important? And we must look and ask, given the content, how is it to be learned? For my purposes, content is going to be thought of broadly. For instance, content could be processes and procedures that need to be understood and followed. Or it could be the applied and theoretical understandings of larger systems, such as government. Or maybe the content is about learning about the physical and natural world. Or perhaps it's looking at our human development, such as theater or art. So before you can consider any assessment, you need to understand what has to be learned. And you also naturally tie that question back to who are the learners themselves. Are you considering a youthful audience, mindful now of how technology can inform and be integrated into these learners' works? Or might you be developing learning and communication systems for adults, for training scenarios, for setting up procedures in computer-mediated environments? Or perhaps you're developing learning systems for environments that use some of the more advanced emerging technologies, as they're becoming very central to healthcare applications, where clinical training is very important and there are attempts made to simulate real-world environments. Or perhaps your learners are coming in through what technology-facilitated online learning has now brought into the classrooms. So asking conversations about where students are learning is very important. But you also want to raise the question about how is the learning being done? Is it being done individually or collectively? And what type of devices are they using for input? Is the device simply keyboard, or perhaps they create a video or use a microphone or even a cell phone as an input device? And did your learners need to make adjustments to moving to working from home? Many questions need to be weighed to allow you to ultimately create and assess the rich type of digital environments that are possible today. Now, reflect for a moment on practices that you may have experienced within the Mallet program itself, where you've been assessed in 100% on online environments in many ways. For example, through reports, discussions on your computer, videos that you shared, and even virtual reality meetings where you interact in environments that are rich simulations of meeting spaces. But before you consider the assessment possibilities, it's still important to think through the planning steps to better understand how to design these environments. Now, Piaget helped us struggle through the concept of using mental schema to look at the way the world is constructed, and in turn how this helps our mind grow. Vygotsky emphasized the value of community among learners. Also, when designing courses, you often need to scaffold in the actual technology process itself. And thinking back to these two key pundits from the 20th century, they still inform us on how people ultimately learn, which should be what is driving our learning designs. Now, Piaget in his observations noted that humans learn from struggling with problems that they can't solve directly. Then they assimilate that problem into what they already know and make a type of mental or procedural accommodation, which ultimately leads them to better understand the challenging situation. Piaget also observed that we go from learning, where we start with experiencing simple scenarios and schema, and these develop over time into more complex understandings. And particularly important for K-12 educators, Piaget also noticed the mental maturation process, which developed over time and allowed thinkers to become more abstract, therefore allowing for different levels of learning. Vygotsky articulated the social aspects of learning. He noted that people learn best when some individual or even some educational material could nudge them when they were within their, quote, zone of proximal development. That is, when they're actually actively learning in an engaging process. Vygotsky's principles can readily be seen in operations in teams and work groups and peer reviews, and in collaborations and interactions among the social community of learners. So well-designed and well-assessed environments proceed from the educator or developer's understanding of what needs to be learned by the environment, and taking that outcome and then backwards design the needed tasks into the learning environment itself. Now, thinking back again about the content that needs to be learned, and mindful of the learner, him or herself, it becomes necessary to then articulate what the learning objectives or learning outcomes ultimately need to be to have a successful learning environment, where you're fairly certain that the majority of learners have understood the desired content. It becomes necessary to create and operationalize specific outcomes for the learning. These outcomes must have a number of dimensions. They need to assess the cognitive parts of learning, but they also need to assess behaviors that might be important, and they need to look at the psychomotor requirements for learning particular skills or procedures. Objectives need to be observable and as clear as possible, because the objectives in turn guide and focus the learning environment development process, and ultimately the assessments that need to align with the objectives themselves that you've developed. Assessment is so intimately tied into the design process that two very well-known design models, ADDIE, which is used in instructional design, and Agile, which is used in programming and systems development, both integrate that iterative assessment process into their guiding documents, as you can see in the schematics taken from these organizations here. But actually implementing a learning environment, good instructors can often embed assessments within the process. There's the area we call formative or ongoing assessments that happens during the learning itself. This should be guided by constructive feedback for growth and corrective feedback when needed. A good formative ongoing assessment can help all learners get to the final larger summation goals. A summative assessment might be a paper, a project, a high-stakes test. These activities often come at the end of the learning experience itself, or at significant checkpoints in larger courses or activities. The process of integrated assessment allows for giving individual support within the course, and may even make you make modifications as you're going as the course emerges. And you can think about the formative process as the instruction and short-term evaluation that guides the process during development itself. These could be checkpoints during the project. They could be discussions within an online course that further the conversation and that allow for instructor observation. They could be small quizzes that guide the student or client and that inform the instructor ongoing progress. And achieving here then moves towards that summative piece of evidence that shows how ultimately successful the learner has been in achieving the desired outcome and objectives. We often see this in evidence in projects, in presentations, reports, unit tests, or even high-stakes tests. Or they could be a process that they successfully complete, such as a worker learning how to operate a forklift. Again, in today's world of threaded technologies, not only the summative process, but the formative process can allow you to understand learning under development. And research and common sense has pointed to the importance of both formative and summative assessments. And you want to be able to assimilate and respond to those assessments with your student population. If you noted that the assimilation, or lack thereof, of the desired understanding isn't there, you can trigger possibly a reteach situation. Looking at assessment from another angle is to step aside the immediate learning environment and experience and consider testing that can go beyond the basics, so to speak, beyond the classroom experience itself. Perhaps your students will be tested as in high-stakes tests or in a licensure exam. In these situations, when the learning assessed is compared to a larger population beyond your immediate students, you have a normed group. Thus, these are known as normed reference assessments. When local, departmental, higher education assessments, any situation where individuals are assessed against specific course criteria, those assessments are conversely known as criterion referenced assessments. Thus, your learning environment and the assessment development and awareness might have several levels of hierarchy. Your learners might be evaluated with a localized criteria, but that need to be followed, but they also might be required to take a larger normed population, and you will have to prepare your students for that as well. Speaking to the normed reference high-stakes tests that we all know to be very important, you need to consider measures of the test question reliability and validity, and even if the test questions are covering all of the content. Now, for the designers of high-stakes tests, much time is spent on ensuring these measures are appropriate. Even if you're developing smaller classroom tests, you should keep these principles in mind. And thinking about assessments you might design, we also have those richer assessments, which can be embedded into the learning. But reflecting on the test question measures, you might call the questions we're going to look at initially here as classic assessments that come after somebody has completely finished the learning, and these type of questions still also needed to be considered for their reliability and validity. Now, the strength in these classic test questions comes from the fact they can be easily graded. We have many automatic ways of scoring these, and test questions have become available through test banks, making it easier to develop these questions. Also, properly done, test questions can even seem like a type of game, particularly with some apps that have been developed. And these types of test questions can be easily scaled and distributed, as evident with the high-stakes tests. Here's an example of a few of the testing programs that are coming out. They have particular appeal to K-12 teachers who have to prepare students for the high-stakes test, but they are also becoming popular in corporate and procedural trainings. However, developing good test questions is not as simple as having a program that makes the mechanics easy. When designing your test questions or evaluations coming from these test banks, consider the level of Bloom's taxonomy that's involved. At the base of this learning taxonomy, you will have fact recall, but you must also integrate higher levels of reasoning, which can be challenging with simple test questions, and generally these questions come after the learning process has been completed. Here are just some of the ways that knowledge can be tested through emerging technology testing programs, which allow you to make quick short answer formats. These type of test items can be integrated into tech-threaded instruction, such as you might deliver through Google Educator, Schoology, learning management systems, and the like. Your more sophisticated analysis, though, is going to come through projects and items that integrate both the learning and the assessment. For example, the two items on the left are assignments that were embedded within the Moodle process. One of them is creating a game within a Prezi or PowerPoint. Or it could be the assessment that was built into building a Google site within which a portfolio is to be placed. Or you can make the project part of the learning. Perhaps having an outdoor gardening, which is teaching K-12 students about agriculture or math. Or having students program a project for the art department. Or having the heavy equipment training students clear a fresh surface for the groundbreaking ceremony. Most likely, these richer assessments will require criteria against which success can be determined. Criteria can be explicated through well-written instructions and directions which itemize all the components that need to be included in a successful project. For instance, criteria could be specified as in a sheet that explains the chemical properties that will be understood, or to the right of a criteria list that explains how a science lesson itself should be conducted by science teachers in general. These criteria lists need to be clear and inclusive of all the expectations. Rubrics can be used as well, but need to be developed to address again all the learning objectives. Too often they're weighted towards the delivery and performance, and they're not clear enough about the content that needs to be developed. There's also the possibility that some learners may simply do what is needed to attain a passing grade, thereby gaming the system, without really putting in their best effort. Now, let's return and consider the ongoing formative assessments and how you might see these in digitally enhanced environments. Mindful that so much of what you learn today is digitally enhanced, where can you look for the evidence of learning before you reach the final step? Analytics refers to the analysis of available data, and we've seen that gradebook programs can give data on quizzes and interactions before a final project is achieved. But with the fact that social interactions are often mediated through technology, there are ways that you can use these environments to provide insights into learning. First of all, computer platforms can often give you data about what's happening. This, of course, ties into where and how you're observing your students in technology-mediated environments. The analytics within online courses often can show when students have signed in, what particular assignments they looked at, possibly how long they stayed with the assignment or learning management system, and can give you a lot of information. Websites, which are becoming a popular way to host information about topics, can often yield analytics related to trends, time spent on a particular page, and the like. They don't necessarily, though, show you whether a participant particularly was engaged or interested. And, for example, in virtual reality environments, you often can get information about how long avatars visited and stayed in a particular location. And if you're using social media platforms, you might want to see how many people responded to a particular item, how many likes and dislikes you get. And given that there are so many different ways that students and learners can input their technology learning, an entire field of study is emerging to really examine the way that user interface is being designed and to determine if the interface itself is productive. What can ultimately be intuitively determined in face-to-face meetings needs to be deliberately designed into e-threaded environments. So as you foray into designing your own learning environments, take that initial big picture, design engaged immersive experiences, and check to see if they're meeting your expectations and learning objectives.